world, but they were not sacred, and neither is the story that describes them. We must commit ourselves to use our intelligence, our skills, whatever they may be, and our own perception, as well as the perception of those who were there on that day, to determine what happened and to draw the appropriate policy conclusions. I'd now like to turn to my PowerPoint and give you a few examples of difficulties with the official narrative or myth of 9/11. As we examine them, let's notice that again and again we're asked to accept what is not credible and to discard what we or others have seen with our own eyes and what we think with our own brains. And I suppose, I don't need any text now, maybe we can turn lights down, can we? These are the 19 hijackers. Now if we look for a moment at the attack on the Pentagon, the chap who is of key importance is this fellow, Hani Hanjour, because he was the designated pilot. He was the only one, we were told by the investigating agencies, that had the capability to fly American Airlines 77 into the Pentagon. So, seems like a pretty clear-cut case. We've got Hani Hanjour, the agent of the crime. We've got the target of the crime. We've got the weapon, a Boeing 757, with which the agent executes his crime. Right away, a little red flag goes up. Mr. Hanjour had never piloted a 757 before. Indeed, he had never flown a jet of any kind before. Imagine the conditions on the plane in that day of extreme stress as a small group of terrorists tries to subdue a very big and very strong pilot and co-pilot, keep all the passengers at bay, supposedly with little knives, and this man who's never flown this plane, or any plane even vaguely like it, has to turn it around, it's headed out west, find the Pentagon, and then crash into the Pentagon. Now you may say, well, okay, that's quite the feat, but suppose he's a particularly good pilot, a flexible sort of guy who can adjust to the circumstances. Let's look at the record. The New York Times, these are all public sources I'm using here, has an article on Mr. Hanjour called "A Trainee Noted for Incompetence." I now quote, Flight Academy staff members characterized Mr. Hanjour as polite, meek, and very quiet. But most of all, the former employee said, they characterized him as a very bad pilot. Quote, I'm still to this day amazed that he could have flown into the Pentagon, the former employee said. He could not fly at all. Well, that's striking. Here's a man who trained in Arizona in the late 1990s, and he trained on this kind of plane, Cessna, yet he had no difficulty with this one on 9/11. Well, I can hear some of you objecting, that's all very well, but that fellow probably had experience of Mr. Hanjour in the late 90s. Who knows, he may have gone off somewhere and gotten some really good training and become a crack pilot by September 11, 2001. Next, I quote Newsday. At Freeway Airport in Bowie, Maryland, 20 miles west of Washington, flight instructor Sherry Baxter instantly recognized the name of alleged hijacker Hani Hanjour when the FBI released a list of 19 suspects in the 4 hijackings. Hanjour, the only suspect on Flight 77 the FBI listed as a pilot, had come to the airport 1 month earlier seeking to rent a small plane. So this testimony is about 1 month before September 11th. However, when Baxter and fellow instructor Ben Connor took the slender, soft-spoken Hanjour on 3 test runs during the second week of August, they found he had trouble controlling and landing the single-engine Cessna 172. Here's a man, therefore, that had trouble handling the Cessna 1 month before 2001, but had no difficulty, apparently, with the Boeing 757, which he had never flown before. Well, perhaps you say it was an easy kind of maneuver. After all, these days you just have to get in and punch in your GPS and off you go. But you can't punch in a GPS that will crash you into the Pentagon. at the very least, the last part of that exercise had to have been done manually. And here's a description of the exercise by a former instructor at West Point. Quote, Hangier conducts a well-controlled downward spiral, descending the last 7,000 feet in 2.5 minutes. Brings the plane in so low and flat that it clips the electrical wires across the street from the Pentagon and flies it with pinpoint accuracy into the side of the building at 460 knots. And remember, he didn't just dive into the roof. He decided to do a quite intricate maneuver which brought him into the side of the building, carefully avoiding a much more accessible side of the building, which would have been easier for him to strike, which had the office of Donald Rumsfeld and, of course, General Myers, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Instead, he went round the building into the only part of the building that had recently been reinforced. The Pentagon was undergoing reconstruction and reinforcement of the walls, and only one section had been finished at that time with Kevlar, especially strong windows and so on. That's the bit he got. Well, here's another little bit. This is from ABC News, from an air traffic controller talking about them tracking Hangier as he came in. The speed, the maneuverability, the way he turned, we all thought in the radar room, all of us experienced air traffic controllers, that it was a military plane. You don't fly a 757, she says, in this manner. She goes on to say, we were relieved. We thought, this must be a fighter. This must be one of our guys sent in, scrambled to protect our capital. And finally, a little line from the Washington Post, September 12th, the day after 9/11. Aviation sources said the plane was flown with extraordinary skill. So I'm saying to you that just as an ordinary person without any particular experience with planes, I'm scratching my head at this point. On this extremely stressful day, this little guy who can't fly a Cessna properly gets in his 757, turns it around, goes to the Pentagon, and does this amazing little maneuver, boom, into the wall, and I'm really starting to find my credulity, challenged at this point. So you say, well, but who are you? What do you know, MacQueen, about flying planes? It's true. It's also true, however, that I never would have even looked at this or thought about this if pilots and air traffic controllers hadn't brought this to our attention. And I'll just give you 2 examples. Let's see what Captain Wittenberg has to say about this. I'll give you a site later where you can find all this testimony. Here's a mini CV for him. Retired commercial pilot, flew for Pan Am and United Airlines for 35 years. Flew a bunch of Boeing planes, and you'll notice it includes 757, the plane in question. Over 30,000 total hours flown. Had previously flown the actual 2 United Airlines aircraft hijacked on 9/11. Blah, blah, blah. Former Air Force pilot. You get the idea. What does Mr. Wittenberg say? I don't believe it's possible for a so-called terrorist to train on a Cessna 172, then jump in the cockpit of a 757, 767 class cockpit and vertical navigate the aircraft, lateral navigate the aircraft, and fly the airplane at speeds exceeding its design limit by well over 100 knots. Make high-speed, high-bank turns exceeding, pulling maybe 5, 6, 7 Gs. The aircraft would literally fall out of the sky. I couldn't do it, and I'm absolutely positive they couldn't do it. The government story they handed us about 9/11 is total BS, plain and simple. For a guy to just jump into the cockpit and fly like an ace is impossible. There's not one chance in 1,000. Well, Captain Wittenberg, the Canadian government wants us to believe it. One more. Commander Kolstadt, U.S. Navy retired commercial airline captain with 27 years experience. Aircraft flown includes the 757. We can skip the other details. We'll go down to 23,000 plus total hours flown. And what does he have to say? At the Pentagon, the pilot of the Boeing 757 did quite a feat of flying. I have 6,000 hours of flight time in Boeing 757s and 767s and could not have flown it the way the flight path was described. I was also a Navy fighter pilot, air combat instructor, U.S. Navy fighter weapons school, and have experience flying low altitude